What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the day one metagame after the Arishem and Alioth nerfs. First things first, I think a lot less about this metagame has actually changed due to the Arishem and Alioth nerfs, and a lot more is due to just general metagame flow, making people experiment just a bit more. Arishem and Alioth are still going to be played a decent amount. My first reaction to the Arishem nerf was that I thought it might kill the card. I think after having seen it in action and played it myself, it's a little bit worse, but basically kind of the same. It's probably going to be fine. It's not going to be something that is worth getting mad about anymore, probably, but it's also not going to be something that is ever going to be, in my opinion, anywhere close to the best deck in the game again. It could be in the future, but right now, the major changes seem to be in the rise of this deck, which I consider a very well put together deck. It was my best deck on the day by far, with a 66% win rate, and what I really like about it is that it uses Penny Parker's ability to get a 5 energy turn 4 in order to get Galacta plus Kitty Pryde online a turn early. When that isn't happening, you're still a very functional, good, powerful mid-range pile. This deck has a lot of different ways to play, but functionally, it's just a mid-range pile that has a nut draw with Penny Parker, giving you 5 energy into Galacta on 4 plus Kitty Pryde, which is effectively like playing Galacta on 3 because you're getting that proc on 4. This also works with something like Gwenpool. So you have not only Galacta with a 4+1, you have Gwenpool with a 4+1 in after the Penny Parker. People have asked me if I think Thena could go in here. It's possible that Thena could go in here. I have enjoyed this version of the deck because it's not just pure stats. If anything, this is more of a tech and surprise deck. What this deck is trying to do is win with cards like Red Guardian that are very disruptive, cards like Shang-Chi that are very disruptive, cards like Juggernaut that are very disruptive. You have a lot of different options for interrupting your opponent's game plan while outputting large amounts of power with Galacta, with Gwenpool, and of course, you have Captain Marvel, who is able to make it much easier on you when you are trying to make those crucial final turn decisions because she's gonna solve for everything. This felt like a really strong contender when I played it, a customizable deck that uses Penny Parker in a way that I haven't seen her used previously, and I think might be the real key to her succeeding over the long term. One of the prevailing beliefs among many of my high infinite friends is that this deck, Move Bounce, is just busted. It is just broken, and they are very annoyed that it got a buff in the form of Frigga gaining a point of power. That buff doesn't really matter to whether or not Move Bounce is busted or not. It's not an impactful thing in any way, but what they're worried about is a deck that they consider extremely powerful being picked up by more people. Here's the thing about Move Bounce, though. It's just kind of hard to play. It has always been hard to play, and an extra point of power on Frigga does not make it easier. I've also seen some builds of this deck that are looking to use Penny Parker in here, which goes extremely well with Frigga, actually, because you get that move, you get that thing, and then you copy it after it has that move. It's like a sort of budget Madam Web that allows you to move stuff around when you don't have Madam Web. I'm not sure she's a permanent inclusion, but she's definitely worth mentioning as far as things that I've seen. This I would still consider the stock list, but it's a little bit flexible. We've seen the Penny Parker in there, we've seen people playing Falcon, we've seen no US Agent. There's room around the margins here, but I think you can pretty well guess what the required cards in this deck are. It's all the ones that say move on them. Madam Web has ascended to become the new Loki, and frankly, I think she's more like that than Loki ever was. And when I say like that, I mean capital L, capital T. I'm referring to a specific thing here. She is a very, very strong card if you're in the top 100 in the world, and then basically everywhere else, she's just not that as good. And I think that dynamic is so strong with this deck, where I think if you asked a lot of my friends who are making up a big portion of the top 50 right now, they'd tell you this is probably the best deck in the game. It's extremely powerful in terms of point output. It goes over the top of stuff very well. It's hard to actually deal with this deck, short of stuff like, you know, Invisible Woman, Shadow King, Killmonger. That's you can do it, but it's not easy. And the only times you're really going to beat it is when it bricks. And luckily, it still bricks a decent amount of the time. You can interrupt them with Red Guardians on your Madam Webs. Like, it's not the end of the world, but this is an extremely powerful deck that matches up very well into a lot of mid-range decks because it is able to just go over the top and avoid all sorts of interaction. The deck is quite strong. It is also quite hard to play. That's the top line. Second Dinner tried to stop the Goon Knight Renaissance, the Goonaissance, by nerfing Black Widow, but frankly, I don't think they did enough to make this deck go away. It maintains a powerful presence in the metagame, in my opinion, and it is absolutely the best deck in the world for beating Arishem. That is basically always going to be true, not only because this is an excellent deck at having, you know, I guess it's not really like an excellent deck at having Darkhawk and Cassandra. It has them. It's not like better than other decks at having them. But it's a better deck at beating Arishem without them than you think, because Arishem cares a lot about actually being able to leverage that energy advantage, and discarding stuff with Moon Knight, with Black Bolt, is relevant to their ability to leverage that energy advantage. This is especially like cogent right now because Agent Coulson, which is one of the cards you hate to see the absolute most when Arishem plays against you, because it makes them have more cards and your job is to make them have less cards, is now like kind of iffy in the deck because of when Arishem starts actually getting that energy. In other words, this is a better matchup into Arishem than it was previously. Even though Arishem is now shuffling 3 less cards into the deck, this is still going to be better for you as the Goon Knight player. And I do think this is important to note, people are playing plenty of Arishem still. For those who were worried that it is absolutely gone, I can tell you that is not happening. The one thing I'm sure about with current Arishem is that a lot of his sort of gameplay style is still there. You replace Agent Coulson with Valentina, and that's a really good card to have access to because ultimately losing Agent Coulson really hurts. Being able to replace with something similar, but that works with your new curve, is very important. I feel like when I play this deck that there is one too many 2-drop, right? Or I don't know the grammar on that. It's late. I'll just leave it in. There is probably one too many 2-drop in this deck. And I think that it should probably be another 4, but I'm not sure what 4 it should be. Maybe it should be, you know, Gwenpool or something like that. But I can tell you that in a few days, I think it should almost certainly be Doom 2099. And right now, this deck is, it's worse, right? Like, Arishem is a worse deck than it was. I think that's pretty clear at this point. But it's not so much worse as to be unplayable or worthless or anything like that. It is worse, I think, but it's not by a massive amount. And I think Arishem was so far removed from like actually being the best deck that if you were someone who was already playing Arishem and you just like make this Valentina for Coulson swap, you're probably going to be fine. It basically just means that there's an increased focus on 2s and 4s and a decreased focus on 3s. 3s are now a very awkward card that for basically anyone playing this deck. I honestly am thinking about maybe, like, I had a copycat in here, and it's just like, that has to go. Like, you don't actually want to be playing a 3-on-3 anymore, because that's when your energy starts, and you need to be getting full access to that. You need to be, like, using that to play a 4, and then going into a 5. And so I don't have Agent Coulson in here. I don't have copycat in here. I don't have any 3s in here. And I think that's probably what it looks like going forward. But it is sort of maybe a little bit up in the air, but I strongly suspect that the goal here is no longer going to involve 3s in any way. So really, if you wanted to have conspiracy brain about this, this is how they screwed over the Arishem free-to-players. Now you don't have free-to-play Agent Coulson, and you probably have to go get Valentina. They got you. I don't really think that's on purpose, but that definitely is like the major thing that I noticed about this is like 3s are really bad, Valentina is really good, And fours are really good. We want like scaling fours that are good. There aren't a ton of those right now, but we're getting one in a few days in Doom 2099. I'm seeing more of this deck than makes sense to me. It feels fairly coherent, but I don't think this deck is as good as it, looks, basically. I'm a little suspicious of a deck that it's like, all right, well, if you don't have a 1-drop, your Wiccan is off. I like what it's doing in a general sense in terms of being a more low-to-the-ground Thanos deck. I think that's generally how I would like to play Thanos. I'm not sure specifically about the Psylocke Wiccan stuff. The rest of it makes a ton of sense to me. We're just playing a mid-rangey style deck and then using our stones in order to go over the top with our Mockingbird. That's perfect. I totally get it. Psylocke Wiccan, I'm not really sold on here. I get what's going on, but it feels like for a deck that generally has very high quality cards, it is introducing an element that could really go against that. Its cards are going to be less high quality because they're Psylocke or a Wiccan that isn't on. And so I think it's possible that this general shape of Thanos ends up being roughly correct. This, like, I'm going to play a bunch of really big 3s and 4s and stuff, and then weave in stones, and then play a big Mockingbird. That I think could be, like, roughly correct. I'm not nearly so sure about the inclusion of Psylocke and Wiccan. It's a very powerful high roll when you hit it, but I do wonder about that long term. And I'll be interested to see what the performance of this deck is as people get more time to actually play with it, adapt to it, and see what's going on. If you want to play an actual dedicated Quicksilver Wiccan deck, I suspect this is the best one, or something in this vein is going to be the best one. It has the right amount of weird interaction and power, Fenris Wolf and Red Guardian and Shang-Chi, and I think I'm so much more okay with being a Wiccan deck that runs Shang-Chi if I am also playing Fenris Wolf, and that's really what makes this one feel like the best version of the deck to me, is that it's not just Shang-Chiing with no synergy. It's got synergy reasons for Shang-Chi to be included in the deck, and I think that's just really nice. This is a powerful deck. I think everyone at this point knows how this deck plays and knows what this deck does. I'm actually really interested in this specific shell going into January, as Iron Patriot Quicksilver Negasonic feels like an incredibly powerful opener to a deck that is already very strong. I think this is probably what I would call the stock Wiccan deck. And that's not to say that there are no other options for Wiccan, because there's like 75 other options for Wiccan. There's a million different things you can do with Wiccan right now. He's a very flexible card. By the same token, there's a million different things you can do with like your Antivenom deck right now. There's a lot of diversity in 4/7s that cheat energy. You're gonna be able to play some kind of mid-range pile most of the time, as long as you have one of those build-arounds. As an example of a different kind of Wiccan build, I have been seeing a decent amount of this, and honestly, like, I do like what's happening here. I think this deck is as close as Devil Dinosaur has ever been. Not ever, but like has been in probably the last year to being actually good. Like, this is a deck that has real upside. One of the big issues with Devil Dinosaur decks is there's rarely a second thing to target with Mystique. And that can be alleviated by including Gore. But the problem with that is that you don't always have the energy to make Mystique target the Gore. And this deck fixes that in two ways. One is Wiccan, one is Penny Parker. And that allows this deck to actually have good enough Mystiques to run. One of the things that I'm almost never going to feel good about is running Mystique with only one good target, or even if this deck didn't have the second way of ramping out the Gore in terms of Penny Parker, I would feel bad about that too, because it's not like it's going to be consistent enough. But this deck, I think, just passes my consistency threshold checks for being a deck that I actually want to play Mystique in that isn't playing Antivenom. I also think it's worth pointing out that people might want to try adapting this shell to Antivenom, because there's a lot of things that go really well with that card in this deck. I still consider this roughly the default AV Galacta deck. The basic thing I want to get across talking about this, though, is like, it's just very, very difficult to make an AV Galacta deck that is playing things like Zabu and Hydra Bob and Luke Cage and Antivenom and Copycat and Galacta. Once you've got like those cards in there, the other cards in the deck can just kind of be whatever. Like there's like this, it's just kind of hard to make one of these decks that is actually bad. If anything, this deck's issues are that it has the risk of getting out-competed by the other mid-range decks in here, because ultimately, when you look at this deck, I think it makes sense when mid-range decks are going small, but right now, there's a lot of mid-range decks that are going very large, and so this deck might just not have the numbers to compete with the other mid-range decks that we've talked about, because it just doesn't have enough beef. It's not able to go over the top of those decks. It also is missing out on the ability to run like as many tech cards as some of those decks. Like, for example, the first deck we talked about, we have not just, Red Guardian, we also have a Shang-Chi, we also have a Juggernaut. We've really only got one slot in here for that, and that's being used on a Cosmo. I do think that right now this deck is in need of work. I am positive that there is something good in the Antivenom sort of sphere. I am not positive that it is exactly this list. I'm putting this Hela deck on here in sort of deference to the fact that I am fairly sure it's better than people think it is, and that you should know what people are doing when they play Hela. I'm not 100% on this being the absolute best build of Hela. I have talked only briefly to Danish about the choices being made in here, and I have my own sort of ideas about like things I'd like to explore in the deck, but what I will tell you is that this deck is a pure gambler's deck. You are going to be taking risks, and that is something you are going to need to have an appetite for, even more than a normal Hela deck. The appetite that you will need to have for risk to play this deck is higher than any other Hela deck that you've played, because you're probably going to be put in situations where you have Hela and something else that can come out of a Ghost Rider, and you're supposed to play for that 50-50 get the Hela. That's real. The fact that this deck doesn't have Luke Cage is probably my biggest knock against it. I wish I could get it in there, but also this is a deck that is better at winning without Hela than any other Hela deck that I've played, and I think that is notable as well. After playing a little bit of Scream, it feels like it always has felt to me. The normal Scream deck is just, it's normal. This is fine. It's a totally acceptable deck in this current metagame that we have. I consider it pretty good. Like, it's not, you could do some cool stuff with this. It's not the worst thing in the world. If you don't want to play the current Alioth, I think that that is the spot that I'd be the most keen to mess around with. I'm kind of interested in trying a Cannonball there. I'm interested in trying maybe a different 6-drop there. Just something that people aren't really going to expect. Maybe a Dr. Doom. I don't really know. But I am very impressed with just how good Scream has consistently been. If you just want to play a deck that is basically always going to be playable, I kind of think this deck might be the deck to invest in. And before people are like, well, I don't have Luna Snow, I don't really think she's required. The Scream core can be whatever you really want it to be, and it just will do enough work. Like, you're never going to be like, oh man, I regret getting Scream, as long as you can play a deck that looks even kind of like this. This has been a consistent performer for an extended period of time, and I think it's time people start putting respect on her name. Is it the best deck in the game? I don't particularly think so, but she's always just going to be good enough to be playable. If you've been paying attention, one of the things that you probably will have noticed throughout this video is that there's a vast amount of decks that are all jockeying for being the best mid-range deck. And mid-range here, I'm defining pretty loosely, but I think mostly A, you know it when you see it, and B, what you're trying to do effectively with a mid-range deck is do points and also have some interaction, a combination of offense and defense, reaction, and proactive strategies, whereas a deck like this is very much just trying to do points. And typically, if you are able to play a deck like this, or move bounce or normal bounce, the idea with it is you're going to go over the top of your RSMs, of your mid-range decks. You're just going to have more points than them. I think right now the mid-range decks are very, very strong, and they're strong enough that that is not a guaranteed win in the matchup. I think that is why I'm a little bit surprised to have seen as much Moon Girl as I have. I'm seeing a lot of this deck, and it's like pretty good. If you are not someone who wants to learn all the intricacies of move bounce, if you want to play this, or you want to play normal bounce, I think that's fairly reasonable. I consider move bounce the best of the decks in this sort of genre, where like genre here is defined as throw priority, have a billion points of power on the final turn of the game. Like that's a genre of deck for me, and move bounce is the best of them for me. But I don't think this deck is that far behind, and I don't think normal bounce is that far behind. And I think if you want to take that kind of aggressive posture into the metagame and say, like, look, mid-range decks, I'm just going to have more numbers than you, I think either of them is an appropriate choice right now. Thanks so much for watching the video. After the reception to this patch, I'm kind of wondering about if Marvel Snap might be like straight up cooked. Like, I saw this patch and I was like, wow, they made a bunch of really good decisions. They nerfed Arishem, but not in such a way that made it unplayable. They nerfed Alioth, which, again, not in such a way that made it unplayable. They buffed the card everyone's getting for free, Elsa Bloodstone. They dropped Kitty Pryde down a series, so she's basically free to go with the Elsa Bloodstone. I saw all of that and I was like, wow, this is a really good patch. And the argument I got against that, where there were two, really. The first was from disaffected Arishem mains who were like, I'm going to quit the game. They nerfed my only deck. I will say this. Your deck is probably still playable, but I expect to see a lot of complaining, Reddit-wise, about having to replace Agent Coulson with Valentina. The second type of disagreement to my assessment that I saw was people who wanted the OTA to shake up the meta. They wanted big buffs to something. They wanted, nerfs to things that would actually make the meta change. And I think that's really where I differ from the common consensus, where I'm a little bit, that's not what I want out of an OTA. What I want out of an OTA is for them to take things that are too strong and make them weaker so we can figure out what the metagame is supposed to look like. So there's diversity in the metagame. And as much as I'm in favor of buffing stuff, I don't think you should do it unless you're confident you can do it without making it too strong. I also think, and this is what I'm really getting at, it feels to me like this is purely subjective, just my opinion, all those disclaimers. But it feels to me that every time Second Dinner make a decision, the prevailing opinion immediately becomes that the decision was a mistake. And I'm seeing a lot of this with Arishem. All of my comments, every time I did a video about hot takes defending Arishem, saying it wasn't really that bad, I got killed in the comments. I got people saying, Cam, you just don't know what you're talking about. It's a huge problem. I'm sick of it. You're not really understanding why it's such a big problem. And then the second it got nerfed, all the comments are, I can't believe they nerfed Arishem. I'm so angry about it. And I realize those are two different groups of people. I understand that. The community is not a monolith. It's not the same people just being rude just for the sake of it. But it feels like the opinion that filters to the top, whatever becomes the consensus opinion, is always that the thing that they've done was wrong. It's like the reverse Halo effect at this point. And of all the things that have happened to me over the years as a content creator, noticing this is the one that has made me the most upset and sad and worried for the future. Because it does sort of feel like, I don't know, I'm not saying there's nothing they can do, but it sort of feels like anything they do is going to get the bad reaction no matter what. It doesn't really feel like we're having actual conversations about it. It feels like every decision they make, the people that got hurt by that decision are more vocal than the people that got helped by that decision, no matter what. And that's a thing that I've started to get worried about, and I kind of want to know what y'all think about that. All right, as always, I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.